Yep, I am back. All right, thank you. Good morning. I'm Jeremy Warriner, and today we're going to be talking about the ADA in our community, advocating for a practical application, and also looking at how advocating for accessible DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging enhances ADA application and functionality. And basically, what I mean by that is that I have taken an approach with seeing the rise of DEI. Um, I noticed that people occasionally would include people with disabilities in that diversity category, but usually as an afterthought, and um, started to recognize that what was missing was that they weren't focusing on the accessibility piece first to be able to ensure that we could get everybody in the door to reach those DEI goals. And I have found that advocating for that alongside the ADA is a better way to approach it instead of saying you have this law that you need to comply with, and instead trying to show people the fact that people with disabilities are a vital part of our community. So we're going to talk about that as we get going. I do work as both a consultant, an inspirational speaker, and I'm the CEO of my own organization, Walking Spirit and Spirit Therapies. I provide accessible DEIB consulting and support to any organization in the public sector. And then public speaking. And then the third service that I offer is one for people and families affected by disabilities, which is quality of life, adaptability, and advocacy coaching. And really, that is meant to connect people with disabilities with the different resources that are out there to help them, and to simply just share my 18 years of experience with anybody who finds themselves on this path. So um, let's see. There we
Thank
go. Um,
Jeremy,
sorry.
may I take just a moment to
Yeah.
just briefly tell you a little bit about the folks that are on this call. They are advocacy leadership fellows. I want you to have a little bit of scope of your audience. They are participating in a one-year program to advance their own advocacy and leadership skills in their own life, and then to be able to lend support to others who may not have found their voice yet through advocacy and leadership. And then ultimately, we're asking them to take everything they learn in this series and what they've learned over the last year back to their local communities and really begin to, influence some positive changes. I want to take just maybe 30 seconds to let Mary Beth McKenzie do a touch of housekeeping and then turn it back over to you.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for Jeremy's presentation today. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions at any point during this webinar, feel free to raise your hand or write in the chat. We are going to ask questions or allow for questions to be asked during the presentation, but we will also have a Q&A at the end as well. During the presentation, make sure your camera is off, you are muted, so then Jeremy can focus on sharing his knowledge and just sharing that education for us. But with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jeremy. Looking forward to seeing what you have prepared.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So some of what you're going to see today is coming directly from the ADA National Network's curriculum. I am a certified member of their trainer leadership network. And so to that point, those slides specifically, you will notice some different logos. And I'm going to try to make it a point to read through the slides as I expand on what they talk about, simply for anybody who might have any difficulty viewing them. But so we start off with just basically a disclaimer, which is that information materials and/or technical assistance are intended solely as informational guidance or informal guidance, and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the ADA, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibility under the ADA. The Great Lakes ADA Center is authorized by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research to provide information, materials, and technical assistance to individuals and entities that are covered by the ADA. NIDILRR is a center within the Administration of Community Living, Department of Health and Human Services. The content of this document were developed under a grant from the Department of Education, NIDILRR, grant number H133A110020. However, those contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. So that said, I'm going to start off first by sharing how I acquired my disability. I used to work in the hospitality industry, have over a decade of experience there. I have a degree in consumer and family sciences from Purdue University with an emphasis on hotel, restaurant, institutional, and tourism management. So about 18 years ago, actually just over 18 years ago, I was commuting home from the hotel on DePaul University's campus back to Indianapolis when a 16-year-old turned left in front of me on a county road. The wreckage that you are looking at, literally this picture was taken the day after the car accident. That's the damage that the fire did to the Jeep. And I was sitting in the passenger seat where you see that big indentation, and suffered multiple injuries, including my left leg was crushed. I was pinned in the Jeep by the dashboard. And I suffered severe facial injuries. They were going to do a facial reconstruction. But I was so sick from the burn injuries, I suffered 4th-degree burns to my lower legs, that they could not do that surgery, and all the bones in my face actually knitted back together perfectly during the medically induced coma that I was in for 6 weeks. Unfortunately, my legs did not heal as well and needed to be amputated from above each knee simply to give me a chance at life. I did return to work. It took me a year and a half to get back to work, and we didn't understand the benefits that I had. We didn't understand the law, and it was a very difficult adjustment. And after a year in that role, realizing that I could no longer empathize with guests the way that I needed to be able to do my job appropriately, or even to be able to empathize with employees who were having their own challenges. It wasn't the right environment for me to be in anymore. And like I said, after a year there, we came to a point, actually, it was in the 2008, 2009, when the auto industry bankruptcies happened and the recession took place. One of the leadership positions, one of the 3 leadership positions at the hotel that I was managing had to be eliminated. And that was between myself, the director of operations, the general manager, which obviously that position wasn't going to be eliminated. So actually, there were 4, the director of sales and the director of human resources. And while the general manager had great sales experience, he didn't have great operations background. And so really the director of sales position could have been eliminated without losing the experience that we needed within the operation. They chose to eliminate my position. And part of that may be due to the fact that we never really fully understood how to adapt my job. I was no longer able to crawl around on the floor and look underneath beds and inspect rooms and go into freezers to help with food inventory and that kind of thing in a safe way. And we didn't know that through my benefits from work, that would have included a vocational rehabilitation counselor who could have come in and helped us figure out how to make those changes. We also didn't understand voc rehab. And so when I went through voc rehab, I asked for the bare minimum instead of asking for all the things I needed to be as productive as possible. So just keep that in mind. But that all led to me needing to redefine my identity and my independence. And a big part of that was coming to understand myself as a person with a disability. Um, as I said earlier, when we talk about DEI and belonging, disability really tends to get left out, just like it got left out of the Civil Rights Act. People tend to think that because disabilities cross all demographics, that they're covered by other civil rights protections, or that they're automatically included in that diversity category. But again, if you don't make an operation accessible, and by operation, I mean anything from the movie theater to the hospital to your church, even though churches are exempt, and we'll talk about that as we go. But I think it's important when you start advocating to recognize the strength of the culture of people with disabilities. We have a global culture that crosses all other demographics. We are the largest minority in the world and yet the least represented. We are exponentially growing as a result of trauma and conditions of aging. Um, So adding the for accessibility to achieve that diversity is huge. Like I said, this can help with advocating for a welcoming and practical approach to ADA compliance. Um, the other thing to recognize is that if somebody looks at the ADA and they don't have a disability, it's entirely possible for them to comply with the law without approaching it in a way that makes it welcoming to us or accessible. In fact, that can lead to risk of injury and discrimination. So, and then at the end of the day, recognizing the value of belonging. So having all of those things in place so that all of us can participate in our community enhances not only our individual sense of belonging, but it also enhances the overall public health, if that makes any sense. So again, also recognizing as we get into this that the real size of the population of people with disabilities within, I don't know why that changed the way that lined up again, but so anyways, the Indiana population is about 14%. The United States population is 13%. Global population is 16%. But the CDC recognizes that there are a lot of underreported statistics due to obstacles like pride, fear, and discrimination. And that really they say that globally, about 1 in 4 people have a disability, and that population really is at least a quarter of our population, if not more. Um, I think everybody on here recognizes that disabilities come in all different shapes and sizes. Some are acquired, some we are born with, some come up on us later in life, some are part of our lives from the very beginning. Some are physical, some are sensory, some are intellectual and developmental. Um, and so it's really important when advocating to speak from your experience, but also to recognize that sometimes our experiences, like mine as an amputee, is very focused in the physical. And so I need to make certain that as I'm advocating for people with disabilities, that I'm including everybody and not just myself. So the ADA has 3 different definitions. One is mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. That is the very first one. That covers all different disabilities. Um, Having a history or a record of such an impairment. So that's your medical diagnosis. Maybe something was placed in school records. Maybe it's in your family history, your human resources files at work, government documentation. Even if the disability is not consistently active or it's an intermittent symptoms, you are still covered because you have that history or record. And when I say you're covered, it means that you're covered by the civil rights protections of the ADA. That third definition is being perceived by others as having a disability. And that one gets really weird and confusing. And I have a picture here that shows me sitting on a panel And if somebody in that audience were to say, well, that guy has very visible disability, so these other two people on the panel, they must have some kind of disability too. There's nothing wrong with that assumption. Where it becomes a problem is if that individual or the audience then discriminates against those other individuals, or myself, but those individuals because they think they had a disability. So maybe a month or two down the road, someone in the audience sees the name of one of these panel members and they remember that they were on this panel and think they had a disability, and so they overlook them for a job. Now they've discriminated against that person based on a disability, even though they don't have it, but they are protected by the civil rights protections of the ADA. Any questions on that? Because this can be very confusing. Okay, nobody's jumping in, so I'm going to move forward. You guys feel free to stop me as we go. I'm going to go through these next slides fairly quick. I'm pretty sure I'm preaching to the choir here on what a non-exhaustive illustrative list of disabilities, or in this case, this is the major life activities. These are some examples that are given in the ADA. It is not an exhaustive list. These are just examples. Determining what a major life activity is, especially within the independent living world, is very much up to the person with the disability. For me, getting out into nature, hiking, is a major life activity, but it's something that I'm not able to do without assistive technology. So for me, that would be a major life activity. And if I were to go, say, to a park and there were trails, but none of the trails were set up for somebody with an off-road wheelchair to be able to access, then I might want to take that up with whoever's in charge of that park. There also comes a point where you have to decide how much effort you are going to put into whatever the issue is. And we'll talk about that too as we go. These are some major bodily functions that are listed in the ADA. Again, not an inclusive list. And then this is the list of non-exhaustive list of different disabilities. You'll see that it covers a lot. I don't believe that it covers everything. So, any questions yet? All right. So here we go. The 5 titles of the ADA. Title 1 covers employment.
Jeremy, may I interrupt for just one moment? Lexi, raised
Yep.
her hand if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Um, will these slides be available in accessible format for me to listen to later? Because I'm legally blind and I'd like to listen to that list.
Wonderful. Actually, then in that case, let me go back and read that list.
Thanks.
Do you want me to read all 3 of those real quick?
Can I just have like a short, like just random, like a little bit of some of them?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
So, and yes, I will be happy to make an accessible PDF and send this to you guys so that you can have them as handouts after the fact, to go back to. I'm sorry we didn't get that ahead of time. So on that non-exhaustive illustrative list of major life activities, caring for oneself is at the top. Performing manual tasks, lifting, bending, seeing, speaking, hearing, breathing, eating, learning, sleeping, reading, walking, concentrating, standing, thinking, sitting, communicating, reaching, interacting with others, working. You know what's not on this list? Swimming. That's something that I do for exercise 3 days a week, or should be doing at the very least. So that's just an example. Major bodily functions, they list the immune system, special sense organs and skin, normal cell growth, respiratory, digestive, circulatory, bowel and bladder, and also includes the operation of an individual organ, body, for example, the kidney, the liver, or the pancreas. And then the impairments list says specifically that the ADA AA, which is the Amendments Act, and we'll talk about that too, has a non-exhaustive list of impairments that should easily be found to be substantially limiting, should not require further or extensive analysis. Deafness, diabetes, blindness, epilepsy, intellectual disability, formerly known as mental retardation. That's stated on the slide. HIV infection, partially or completely missing limbs. That's where I fall under. Muscular dystrophy, mobility impairments requiring use of a wheelchair. That hits me too. Major depressive disorder. I've dealt with that. Bipolar disorder, autism, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's one of my diagnoses. Cancer, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, and cerebral palsy. So those are some of the things listed. One of the other impairments not listed here is sleep apnea, which certainly has an impact on people's ability to focus and other aspects of major life activities. So that covers those slides. Again, any questions before we go into the 5 titles? And I'll be reading these more specifically as we go forward. So,
Thank you.
yeah, my pleasure. All right. So the 5 titles of the ADA. This is what affords you your civil rights protections. Title I covers employment, and it prohibits disability discrimination in all aspects of the employment process. We'll delve into that deeper in a few minutes. Title II is public entities. So that prohibits discrimination based in, I'm sorry, I should just read what's on the slide. It requires physical and program accessibility in state and local government entities. Title III is public accommodations, physical and programs in accessibility in restaurants, hotels, stores, and places of business. That is the title of the ADA that most people with disabilities will tell you has had the most dramatic impact on their lives, because it's the one that made our public community services open and available to us. It gave us the ability to enjoy a movie with our family, or to go to travel, or go to restaurants, or go shopping for somebody's Christmas present without needing to take anybody else with us. Title IV covers telecommunication, and this isn't really talked about a lot, but it is important to note that there is a requirement for communication to be accessible to everybody. And so I do have a slide or two to cover that as well. And then Title V, miscellaneous provisions. This is an important one to anybody who doesn't have a disability, but is advocating on behalf of someone who does. So, for instance, if within your work environment, you felt that there was somebody who was being discriminated against because of their disability, and you go to human resources to talk about that or to bring it up, you are now protected by the ADA from any discrimination that may come back against you for advocating on behalf of that individual. So that is something that you need to be aware of. The pictures that I have on this slide for employment show me at a front desk talking to somebody in a hotel. You don't know whether or not the person on the other side of the desk has a disability. Title II, the picture that I listed, actually shows the Indigo bus, because Title II, the public entities, also covers public transportation provided by public entities. Title III, again, that's public accommodations. We have a picture of the last hotel I worked at. You might notice that there's stairs going up to the main entrance. And I got to point out that when my accident happened, right before my accident happened, I was asked by a person in a wheelchair if, as part of the renovation we were doing to the hotel, we were going to make the back doors coming off of the parking lot that came right up to the back doors of the hotel, if we were going to make those accessible. It was a 0-point entry. The only issue were that they were really big double sets of wooden and glass doors that did not have a button to automatically open them. And when I asked if we were going to spend the money to fix that, I was told no, because we already had all of the accessible entrances required by the ADA. And we did. They just were actually in a building that was added on to the hotel after the ADA became law. The hotel was built before that and had not actually been updated, other than this one connection to this new building that had all of the accessible entrances. And then my accident happened, I believe, within that very same week. And 6 weeks later, when I woke up and asked if we could make, well, they asked what I needed to go back to work. Said I didn't know, but those doors needed to be accessible. And they were accessible a good year before I was able to return to the position.
Jeremy, it sounds
Yes,
like Jan has a question. Jan, if
excellent.
you want to come off mute and ask that question, feel free, or if you want to write in the chat, either way works for us.
Was it going in the
Jan, we're
chat?
not, oh yeah, we're not hearing anything, so we'll, if you do have your question, feel free to write in the chat. We'll make sure we keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. All right. So who is covered under the ADA? Who has to comply with the ADA? That is going to be entities with 15 or more employees, public government agencies, regardless of whether or not they receive federal assistance, privately operated commercial entities. Again, that's our schools, colleges, banks, restaurants, theaters, hotels, private transportation, supermarkets, shopping malls, museums, recreational facilities, sports arenas, medical, legal, and insurance offices. And those are, again, just examples. Who is exempt is private clubs and religious organizations. If there are questions about that, the most that I can really tell you there is that um, I believe that there needed to be a line where the federal government is not telling a private organization that's not providing a public service, a public accommodation, that they have to be accessible. Same thing with religious organizations due to separation of church and state. That I think was probably a no-brainer that got put in there. But you should also know that among the first people to or organizations to oppose the ADA were religious organizations, largely because they thought it was going to cost them a great deal of money to modify old churches that were never designed to include people with disabilities. Now, does that mean you don't advocate with them to comply with the ADA? Absolutely not. When I lost my legs, I found myself sitting in a wheelchair in the aisle of the church with my family in a pew, but I couldn't sit with them. So I sat in the aisle and regularly would fall asleep in the view of everybody else in the church, and then have to tell the pastor afterwards that it was certainly because of the medication and not his sermon. Um, it was the sermons. So, but to that point, I also had an issue with the fact that the accessible parking was at the end of the bottom of a hill that you had to go up to get to the main accessible entrance of the church. And yet there was a door right there that we could easily go through. There was an elevator that you would immediately have to get in to get to the main level of the church. But if that door were accessible, it would be a much easier entrance for anybody parking in those accessible spots. It took me a year and a half, but I finally got the church to do it. So showing them that they are keeping potential members of the congregation out is a huge way to help them recognize why they need to do this.
So Jeremy, it looks like Jan does have her hand raised again. I think she is able to take herself off mute. And then I
Okay,
have a question for Courtney.
great.
Hi. I was really interested when you were talking about parks being built in cities. Several of us have asked, will there be an ADA coordinator or is somebody with disabilities that will be on the communities and we're getting the radio silent treatment? Do you have any advice for us?
Not surprised.
Me neither.
So that would absolutely fall under Title II if this is a public park. Parks and Recreation fall under government entities. And so I would probably start by reaching out to the ADA coordinator for the city if Indy Parks is not responding, or if you're not in Indianapolis and you're in a different area, if your Parks and Rec organization is not responding, then I would see if there is an ADA coordinator for the local government. And if there is, that's where I would take it. If there's not, then that's a bit more of a battle, because you always want to get an ally within whatever organization you're working with to pick up that flag with you, right? So the best thing that I can recommend there, if they're in the planning phase and they're not involving people with disabilities, then figuring out who that developer is who we need to get to. And we've got to show why. And again, look at the county statistics, look at the city statistics, look at it's not just those folks that are coming there. Be able to talk about how many people are being discriminated against if they don't make those facilities accessible, including playgrounds and all of that
Thank
kind of
you.
stuff.
Thank
Yeah,
you. That's perfect start. Thank you.
my pleasure. There was another
Hey,
question from
Jeremy.
Courtney. Yeah.
Yeah, so the question from Courtney is, what is considered a safe ramp modification, or what would you consider safe?
Okay. So there are accessible design standards under the ADA. Those are actually laid out in the ADA Amendments Act, which I'm about to talk about. And those those will tell you that a ramp per the ADA needs to be 1 foot in length per inch in rise. So if you have a 6-inch rise, you need a 6-foot ramp. That's not always possible, depending, you can have a landing area and turn and come back if you can only go 3 feet at a time. It really creates a lot of architectural challenges. And so what you have to do, if you're one of these organizations that falls under the ADA, a covered entity, then you have to look at the cost of whatever modification needs to take place to put that ramp in versus the resources of the operation. And if there is an undue burden, then they can get out of needing to put that ramp in. If it's a historical building and putting in the ramp would change the historical nature of the building, then they would be exempt from it as well, in the historical situation. But in most situations, it's not that expensive to figure out. So does that answer the question?
Courtney, let us know if that answers your question, but thank you
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah,
Okay.
it does, because I've gone to several places where I've been like, okay, is that actually considered a ramp? Because they look pretty dicey, and I was
So,
like,
and if you have that question, it's fine to ask that. It's okay to, I would probably reach out to like my local Center for Independent Living
yeah,
and ask them if somebody could go there and measure the ramp
yeah,
and tell you what the situation is
yeah,
and look at it.
yeah,
If you have that question. My first prosthetist's office had a ramp that I couldn't even push myself up that in my wheelchair.
yeah,
And it took a lot of effort to get that changed. So, and they were holding to there wasn't room and it was a undue burden for them to change it, but they were
yeah,
there to provide prosthetic limbs.
yeah,
So, um,
yeah,
yeah,
right,
so the ADA Amendments Act, you guys might hear referred to as the 2010 updates. It's important for you to know that between 1990 and 2009, um, the Supreme Court really whittled away at the protections provided by the ADA. Um, the there were two particular cases that changed the definition of disability and narrowed it to a point that very few people were actually included. And the focus and the attention was more on whether or not the individual has a disability instead of on the alleged discrimination. So a case would come up and it would be attacking the individual's disability who brought up the case instead of exploring the discrimination that took place. So the ADA Amendments Act was put into place to restore that. And so it did restore the original definitions and the protections. The definition itself, the definitions didn't change, but certain interpretations did, including and phrases. So mitigating measures was something that was there, basically saying that with mitigating measures, you're able to achieve more than when your disability is going unmedicated or unassisted with assistive technology, etc. That has nothing to do with determining whether or not somebody has a disability. And so that was changed. Episodic conditions like epilepsy were included and given better protection under that. And some impairments were considered disabilities, like for instance, mine are considered disabilities without any extensive analysis. It's obvious I don't have lower legs. And then broaden protections under that regarded as piece of the definition, again, that perceived by others, was making certain that those people were covered as well. So basics of Title I. And I realize we're at 10:37. I'm going to go pretty quick through this. So the basics of Title I are that they're enforced by the EEOC. So that's another way to go if you need support in employment advocacy. We already talked about the fact that it applies to anybody who has 15 or more employees, including in the private sector. It applies to all state and local government employers, protects against disability discrimination in all employment processes, limits the employer disability inquiry. They cannot ask about the nature of your disability. You want to disclose it, that is up to you. They can ask about your ability to perform the essential functions of the job. And then reasonable accommodations need to be met unless there is an undue hardship. And that, again, just like looking at whether or not a facility needs to add a ramp, and it could be a grocery store that you're saying needs to have a ramp. That's an undue burden in that Title III public accommodations area. But a reasonable accommodation in employment goes to that undue hardship question about whether or not the cost or the changes required create a substantial difficulty for the employer, in which case the accommodation isn't reasonable. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but there are some important terms that you need to know. I think we've covered entity enough, although I do want to add that not only that doesn't just apply to employers with 15 or more employees, it applies to all employment agencies, labor organizations like unions, and joint labor management committees. So a qualified individual is a person who, with reasonable accommodations, can perform the essential functions of the job for which they have applied or been hired to perform. Reasonable accommodations, I already talked about a little bit, but that's a modification to a job, work environment, or the way that things are done that enables a qualified individual with disabilities to enjoy an equal employment opportunity. And so recognizing that is also a way that I advocate, is by acknowledging that reasonable accommodations spark innovation in the way that jobs are done, and you can actually improve your productivity by having people with disabilities employed within your operation. Essential job functions, that's the fundamental duties of a position, the things a person holding the job absolutely must be able to do. If you're hired to answer the phone, you've got to be able to answer the phone. But if a secondary part of your job is running, say in a hotel, running guest requests to the rooms, somebody else could do that part of the job while you're handling the phones, covering that essential function of the job. And then again, undue hardship, which I mentioned, comes at a matter of looking at the accommodation. If it does require significant difficulty or expense, then you got to weigh it against the nature and cost of the accommodation and the size, resources, nature, and structure of the operation. An employer is not, they do not have to make an accommodation if it's not reasonable, if that makes sense. Questions on that? Because I know that can get confusing. All right. And we're going to focus in on Title I more than the others because all of these protections have different forms, but this really tells you what you can ask for in with public entities and with public accommodations as well in Title II and Title III. But in the hiring process, the pre-employment, it has to be accessible and accommodations need to be made. So if somebody's applying for a job and they request a ASL interpreter, that ASL interpreter needs to be there for the interview. No disability inquiry during the recruitment, the screening, or the hiring process. So again, you're not asking about how the disability came about, how the disability affects you. You're asking about the person's ability to perform the essential functions of the job. No medical inquiries or indirect questions about disability. And now, if you require a medical examination of every employee or of every potential employee, then that's fine. But you cannot require a medical examination of somebody because you suspect they have a disability. Many disabilities covered under the ADA are not apparent to others, and the decision to not tell about a disability during hiring is not a lie. It is a legally protected right. After an offer has been made, but employment hasn't started, at that point, some medical inquiries can be made after the job offer has been extended, but before the employment has started. And again, that's if it's required of everybody. Apply the same medical inquiry process to all applicants in a job category. And if the inquiry shows that the person has a disability, the job offer can only be withdrawn if the withdrawal is job related and consistent with business necessity, and no reasonable accommodation can be provided. So that's again, the difficulty and the expense of the accommodation is so significant that they are unable to perform in the job with the disability, then that offer can be withdrawn. After work has started, reasonable accommodation is any change in the work environment or in the way that things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal work employment opportunities. It applies to both hiring and employment, must be provided for known disabilities, determined through an interactive process, and medical information can be collected related to the accommodation need, but must be kept confidential. There is a link on this slide to EEOC accommodations. I want to talk for just a second about what a reasonable accommodations meeting should look like. It should not look like a poker game. It's meant to be a mutual goal to accommodate the disability and achieve the essential functions of the job. It needs to be driven by the associate's needs. It requires flexibility and open-minded exploration. If the employer comes in and says, well, the reasonable accommodation that we're willing to make is that we want to work with you over the course of the next month to get you back to full-time in the office status instead of working remotely, that's not the way it's meant to go. Especially if the person coming in with the reasonable accommodation is saying, well, my reasonable accommodation is for me to continue working from home, and my performance evaluations have supported that I'm just as productive, if not more, in my role working from home. Unless the employer can show an undue hardship, they need to make that accommodation. And that, again, I think we've covered what covers an undue hardship. Reasonable accommodations have to be requested and agreed to by the associate, not dictated by the employer. The picture on the slide is of a poker game, again, because that's not what it's supposed to be. Examples of reasonable accommodations cover changes in your work schedule, job aids, reminders, checklists, picture-based tools. Maybe a housekeeper needs a picture of what a clean room looks like on their cart so that they can always look back to that to be sure that they captured everything they needed to do. Changes in break times, work from home, voice to text software, screen readers or magnifiers, sign language interpreters for key workplace interactions, modified workplace policies, changing policies around drinking water at workstations, changes in in furniture or equipment, additional leave, job restructuring, reassignment to a different job. So again, there are lots of ways to look at accommodating the work environment. Before we go into public entities, which is where we are now, anything on Title I anybody wants to ask about? Okay, public entities.
Wait. Lexi
Oh.
does have her hand up. Lexi, go ahead.
You caught me. All right, go ahead.
Can a Title I accommodation apply to a practicum placement in school, in college?
I'm going to say yes. I'm not an attorney, but if we're talking about a person with a disability who needs a practical experience for their job and they apply for a job or a practical, even if it's an internship that's an unpaid internship, it's still a work experience. They're still working for an employer. If they get hired for the job and they want to disclose that they have a disability and need an accommodation, they can do that, and they should, and it needs to be covered. That's where I would come from, even without an attorney standing behind me on it.
Okay,
Yeah. And
thank you.
And I have found when it comes to advocating for things with the ADA, like for instance, flight, travel, when air travel, there are things that I have to travel with that I need to have with me that I cannot put into a bag. Or there are times where there are things that I need to have with me that I have to put into a bag that are going to weigh extra and require me to have an extra bag. And I've actually said to the people at the ticket counter or the check-in counter, yeah, I'm a person with a disability and I have no option to travel with just one bag. So you can't bill me for the extra bag. I have no idea whether or not that's actually right, but it's worked. So, so I would argue that if you can legitimately see why it's a reasonable request or a reasonable accommodation, that you should be able to say, hey, I'm a person with a disability, and this is why I need to be treated differently in regards to this, because your policy is discriminating against my conditions, if that makes sense. So Title II, Public Entities and Transportation. So this prohibits disability discrimination by all public entities at local and state levels, school districts, municipalities, city and county governments, state departments and agencies. Regulations cover access to all programs and services offered by public entities. Physical access per the ADA standards for accessible design applies. Programmatic access, including non-discriminatory policies and procedures. New construction and structural alterations have to be free of architectural and communication barriers. Public transportation requires paratransit services on all fixed routes. That is enforced by the Department of Transportation. Public housing, housing assistance, and housing referrals is enforced by the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. So I bring that up because while you have the ADA, what office enforces aspects of the ADA changes depending on where the discrimination is taking place. In Title II, it might be the Department of Transportation. It might be the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And there are actually several more, and we'll go to that in just a second. Do you guys need examples of program accessibility? Because that is what we are on. That's this slide. Resigning services to accessible locations, home visits, purchase of equipment, offering aid assistance, auxiliary aids, structural changes if no other option is available. So what that means is if you're presenting a class and it's on the second floor and it's in a historic government building that doesn't have an elevator, but somebody who can't get there without an elevator needs to attend the class, you need to move where that class is taking place. Does that make sense? I'm going to say yes. In its entirety. So a program has to be evaluated both in terms of the parts and the elements that make up the program and in terms of the way that it all works together. So there may be aspects of these slides today that are not necessarily accessible for somebody with a visual impairment.
A quick question that Courtney had in the chat was, are double door entry doors a requirement of construction?
Not necessarily double doors, but it has to be accessible. So there are architectural guidelines regarding how wide the doors need to be and what the buttons, like if there need to be accessible buttons, how the accessible buttons work. And, you know, there are issues like you will find accessible entrances to get into a building, but once you're in, there are not accessible buttons on the bathrooms. That's not necessarily required by the ADA, but it absolutely would be very helpful. And I don't know why it's not required by the ADA, honestly.
And then it looks like Lexi has her hand raised, and then Samara said, is there a required height for a handicap button?
There is, and it's more, I think, a range. I don't know specifically what that height is. I would need to look at the guidelines, but there are different types. And so you'll see just the button, or you'll see the really long, tall butt panel that anybody at any height can hit. Or if their hands and arms don't work, they can even tap with their foot easily. That's where I find that there are issues with the ADA. It gives good guidelines, but it doesn't necessarily cover every opportunity or every situation. So
And Kat actually answers Samara's question with the between 34 inches and 48 inches above the finished floor is supposedly that guideline. And then Lexi, do you want to take yourself off mute to ask your question?
Yeah, I have kind of an interesting question. So, like, sometimes I'll find that you press a button and then you have to, like, move back really fast because the door will hit your chair. Is there going to be something that will kind of change, like, where the button's placed so you don't have to move back as fast to avoid getting hit by the door?
So that sounds to me probably like a situation where that is a single door entry and you don't have an option for an out versus an in.
Mhm.
And I would say if you're having that issue, I would go to whoever's responsible for that facility and I would make them aware of it being a safety risk and that they need to talk with whoever the company is that maintains that for them to adjust the timing on the door so it allows time for you to press the button and back up. Or that the button needs to be relocated to where it's not within the range of the doors opening and closing. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I am going to, in the interest of getting to the last kind of more important things, I'm going to skip over some of the nitty gritty real fast. And then we can come back into Title I if we want to. Again, it's just got a lot of examples and talks about the difference. Oh, we're in Title II. Talks about the differences between new construction and existing facilities. I've already covered a lot of this. But in Title I, we covered a lot of this, but understanding that there are state and local building codes that sometimes argue with the ADA and differ with the ADA. And when that comes up, you basically need to look at which code is the strictest, and that's what needs to be followed. And let's see, we talked about this. So in Title II, we are still in Title II, I believe. Yeah. So in Title II, there are 8 different federal agencies that are designating for enforcing it. The Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services, Departments of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Interior, Department of Labor, Department of Justice, and the Department of Transportation. That's because your discrimination could fall under any one of those situations when dealing with a public entity. What you need to know is that the Department of Justice is where you need to go to file that complaint, and they'll get whatever other department involved as needed based upon the enforcement situation. Public accommodations, that's Title III. This is, again, what applies to pretty much everything we interact with in our day-to-day community. Says no individual may be discriminated against on the basis of a disability with regard to full enjoyment of the goods, services, or accommodations of any place of public accommodation. I already said it's had the greatest impact on the lives of people with disabilities in the United States than any other title. Important thing to know is that new construction built after 1992 has to be fully compliant. Pre-existing facilities have to remove barriers where compliance is readily achievable. Readily achievable means easily accomplished without much difficulty or expense. And there's a balance test again there if there's a barrier as to whether or not it is really readily achievable to remove that barrier. Exemptions include, again, most private clubs, religious organizations, religious schools. Historic properties have to comply to the maximum extent feasible without threatening to destroy the historic significance of the building. It applies to public accommodations, commercial facilities, any private entities that are offering examinations or courses related to educational or occupational certification. So if a private organization is offering, say, a massage therapy course, and that includes the certification, that massage therapy course needs to be accessible. I think we've covered what public accommodations are. This particular slide does have a list. It's lodging, dining, public transportation, recreation, sales, rentals. So rental properties. And I have a horrible time whenever we go to South Haven, Michigan, finding a rental property that's accessible for my family. This is important to know that, say, for instance, you go to a hotel and the self-parking lot is across the street and they're charging a fee for self-parking, but the self-parking lot doesn't have any curb cuts to access the sidewalk. And when you ask about it, you're told, well, it's actually owned by the county and we just manage it for them. You are a tenant utilizing that property. You are responsible for making certain that it is accessible to your guests. So it applies to both. It's not a finger pointing situation. It's we don't want anybody to get hit by a car, so we're going to do the right thing and fix it. And I bring that up because I've recently run into that. So you know what a commercial facility is? This is a little important. It's a private business that isn't open to the public, like a warehouse or a factory. And in that case, it is only subject to new construction and alteration requirements. They are not required to comply with anything else under Title III. This was more of a testing thing. We're going to skip over that. So we've talked about Title II. We've talked about Title III. As a general rule, private entities, so that's going to be your, say, like New Age people up at the at 86th and Ditch, or your hairstylist, or those types of places. They are covered by Title III, while again those public entities are covered by Title II. There may be some overlap resulting in activities that are covered by both, like hospitals that have restaurants. The restaurant is going to be covered by Title III. The hospital is covered by Title II. This is what and I know we're at 11 o'clock. Hopefully you guys can stay for this because it's the most important part. When and how to file an ADA complaint. First thing you have to decide is whether it's worth your time and effort, and that's a personal choice. The first step to effecting that change is communicating with whoever it is that is discriminating, whether it's intentional or unintentional, try to work out whatever the discrimination or the architectural violation is with a conversation first. If the and I would follow that up. I would always follow up the conversation with a letter, so that it's documented. You need to document all interactions that you have with the other party. You need to take pictures of whatever issues, document it as much as you can. If it's something that's a repetitive issue, like there's a Starbucks up the road that moved into a Boston market and they got a drive-through and they rearranged their drive-through, but they didn't rearrange their parking lot. And when the drive-through line has more than 4 cars backed up from the order kiosk, nobody with a disability can park in the accessible parking spaces because the drive-through line cuts it off. If there's something like that going on, document the timetable. See if you can trace when that is a major issue, when it isn't. See that it's repetitive. Document those things and allow a reasonable time frame for the issue to be resolved after you've communicated it with the other party. Send a follow-up letter if it hasn't been addressed. And then at that point, and I say this, you could jump right to the filing a complaint. You could absolutely do that. But if you do that and you don't have your documentation and your ducks in a row, you're going to be hard pressed to prove that they ever should have made any changes, that they knew that they needed to make any changes. So be sure that's all documented. File a complaint with the Department of Justice. There are 2 ways. You can go online to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, and there's a link here that will be on the slides when I email the presentation to you guys, but it's ada.gov/file a complaint. Ensure you have all the backup that you need when you go online. Read about how to file the complaint. Click on the link to file a complaint on that website by submitting a report to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. That's who's always going to handle it, is the Civil Rights Division. And then after you have done that, you got to wait for a response, and it could be months. And I filed an ADA complaint against Starbucks, and it was 6 months before I got something from the DOJ saying that they had selected my case for mediation. And what that means is that without them spending any time on investigating the case, they are asking me and Starbucks to sit down in a room, in this case virtually, and have a conversation. And that's what the mediation is. And if you reach a success in the mediation, then it doesn't go any further and the issue gets addressed. If mediation is unsuccessful, then you have to wait for the DOJ to follow up because the case gets sent back to them by the mediator. That's a private, separate company. The mediator then reaches out, sends it back to the DOJ, and then you wait again for who knows how long until they contact you and let you know what the next steps are. And they might contact you and say, I'm sorry that mediation was unsuccessful. We've looked at this and we don't feel like it's worth our time. So you need to have that, you need to consider that that may be the result. And if it is, and all this time has passed, or if mediation simply is unsuccessful and a lot of time has passed and you've documented more issues over that time, consider refiling your complaint with the new information and start the process all over again. And I would love to tell you that it's fast, but it's not. It takes a lot of time and a lot of waiting and a lot of patience. But it is absolutely worth it because people with disabilities are responsible for enforcing the ADA. There is no ADA police. Those 8 government agencies and the Department of Justice are not out there looking for violations. It is on us to report those issues and to hold the people accountable for making the change.
And then Jeremy, it looks like Jan might have a question, but she can't type it into the chat. So Jan, if you do have the capability to take yourself off mute, feel free.
I'm good. Thanks so much. I'm good.
Okay, did I cover it?
Yes, you did. Yay. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. So there is also some history here, and I wanted you guys to be able to know what some of the other pieces of legislation are that you can also lean on when advocating. There's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we know did not include us, but it's still absolutely a piece of legislation that you can use if needed. There's the Architectural Barriers Act, the Rehab Act of 1973, which that specifically cites Section 504, which required any organization or operation receiving federal funding to be accessible. Then that was really what first gave us a definition for people with disabilities within legislation. Also of note to that, it took until 1977 for anything to be implemented with it, and it required people with disabilities taking over a federal building in California for over a month before Congress would push for any implementation of Section 504. When they cut off the power to that federal building to try to get the people with disabilities out, the people who were deaf, who spoke American Sign Language, went to the windows and signed to people out in the community what their needs were so that they could get their needs met, even though communication had effectively been cut off. But the reality was it hadn't been effectively cut off because people with disabilities have other means of communication. So 1976, we have the Higher Education Act Amendment, which includes students with disabilities. You have the Air Carrier Access Act, which is huge, especially for anybody traveling with assistive technology that could potentially get damaged in the process. And we see that all the time. I hear horror stories, even about someone's power chair going from Australia all the way home to New York when they were actually going to London. So they found themselves in London without a way to move. Terrible situation. 1988, you have the Fair Housing Amendments Act. 1990 was when we finally get the ADA. And then 2008 is the ADA Amendments Act was signed into law. Before, I also wanted to give you a couple other resources, which you'll get through the slides through when I send the handouts to you guys. You also have the resources for myself, the ADA Center, the ADA Trainer Leadership Network, Accessibility Center for Independent Living is wonderful if you've not connected with them. Advocacy is one of their core services. So getting their support and additionally learning how to use your voices, but also systems level advocacy, lending your voice to what they are doing is huge. The other thing that I would recommend all of you do if you've not taken the opportunity is to watch the movie Crip Camp. If you've not heard of it, it was actually produced by the Obamas, but it is an amazing exploration of how we got to the ADA and how there is still so much that needs to take place. And there's just so much you can learn about watching the advocacy effort that the people with disabilities who attended this camp in the early 60s went on to bring about change for all of us is so huge and impactful. So like I said, I have more time and we can go back into some of the nitty-gritty slides if you want, but this, I believe, has captured the most important information for you to know. Questions, thoughts, feedback?
Jeremy, I would just like to begin by saying you've done an amazing presentation today. I think this was very helpful to the fellows in terms of providing them the advanced knowledge that they're seeking. And I can't thank you enough. I know I'll talk to you after today, but I can't thank you enough for your time today. And I'll turn it over to the fellows because I know they have a lot of great questions to ask you.
Let's see, you can go ahead and come off mute and ask your question.
If it's all right, I'm going to stop my share so that we can all see each other.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this presentation. My question is about Title IV with the telecommunication. um, closed caption has been included in almost everything for a while and is increasing, but audio description is just now increasingly becoming included in a lot of things. And I guess my question is it becoming where audio description is becoming part of the telecommunication part of the ADA for audio description to be included in more things for Title IV?
I do not know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I would be more than happy to take a look and see what I can find out and get back to you, if that is okay.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
So audio description, and I have, you guys know, I mean, you guys all got the email with the kind of inquisitive conversations. So is it all right if I just reply to that, Steve, with follow-up answers?
I'm sorry, Jeremy, could you ask that question again?
The email that you had copied me on that you sent out to the group, is it okay if I just reply to that with any follow-up answers?
Yes, I think that's fantastic. That's a great idea.
Okay, so again, that was a question about audio descriptions becoming required under the ADA. Right?
Correct. Lexi, is that correct?
I missed that. I was looking back in the chat because I missed something in the chat. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I just want to be sure I have your question right. It's about whether or not audio descriptions are required under the ADA or will be added to that.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. All right. What else do we have?
Jeremy, I had a question. I have a service dog who she helps me with my everyday needs, and she helps me with the accessible buttons. But do you know if they are completely phasing out with the original touch buttons? Because most of them that I see now are the like wavable ones, and she's not, of course she's not trained to wave because she doesn't have, she can't, her paws can't do that for many reasons, but yeah.
Those are an issue. I have noticed that. I have also noticed, and I don't know how this happens. The movie theater at Castleton Square, they don't have accessible buttons. You have to be able to pull on the door that is accessible, and then it will open on its own for you. But you have to give it that initial pull or push.
That's weird.
Yeah, it is weird. It
That
doesn't
is
make
weird.
any sense to me. I also, the theater at Traders Point doesn't have any accessible buttons.
Yeah,
They were
yeah,
built after 1990.
Yeah.
So I will look to see what the actual code is on that, but I'm curious. So is that something then that your service animal could receive new training on?
I'm curious about that because she's 5 years old, and I haven't asked them yet, but I get her recertified in a couple of months, so that's probably a question I will bring up in her recertification, because that's how I've seen those buttons more often than not, and I've just been curious about that.
I believe the button is still the standard.
Okay.
But I will look into what that is, and I'll get back to you and let you know what the accessible design standards say.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And then again, that question then comes to, when do you decide that you want to advocate about this? Because if you're starting to see
Right.
those show up more and more,
Right.
again, I mean, even just letting somebody know, hey,
Yeah.
I have a service animal, this is what they do for me, but the way that you've gone about applying the assistive technology is actually preventing my service animal from doing their job.
Mhm.
And thank you for bringing up service animals. That's another thing that I didn't really go into detail on because I thought maybe this group might know. But the ADA only recognizes dogs who have been trained to provide or to do specific tasks for a person with a disability or miniature ponies. And I have never seen somebody with a service pony in the community. I would love to see that happen sometime. Oh, somebody has. Lexi. Okay.
I did have another question real quick. So when it comes to turning radius is like when I go into restaurants and people park, like trucks do it most of the time, but they park over
Over the crosswalk?
over the sidewalk. Is there any like additional fines like implemented for that, or is it just the regular fines for the parking spaces?
So this has been one of the biggest challenges that I have faced, is in getting those things enforced in a way that tells the person don't do this again,
Right.
or makes it clear. My understanding is that there's like, I don't think there's any additional fines necessarily. I don't know that even that fines very often get applied because more often than not, the person's gone before the police
Right.
are there to give a ticket.
Right.
And what I have experienced is, like for instance, at a hotel, they will go out occasionally and they will they'll put like a tag or something on a car for the police to then come and address.
Yeah.
But in the strip mall parking lot at, again, 86 and Ditch, gives you
Yeah.
clue as to where I live.
Yeah.
I've encountered a motorcycle that was consistently
Oh yeah.
chained up to the accessible pole, to the sign for the accessible parking. But with the motorcycle chained up to it, it was blocking the front of the accessible spot and really creating a situation where I didn't want to hit this person's motorcycle. I mean, maybe I did a little bit, but
Yeah.
but what
Yeah.
I found was that when I went into the restaurant that was closest, and I was like taking a guess, and I went into the restaurant and I said, "Hey, I noticed this motorcycle here. Can you guys get a hold of whoever's in charge of the lot?" Because it's not the restaurant. The restaurant doesn't own the lot.
Yeah.
Again, they're a tenant. They're required for, they are responsible for enforcing the ADA there.
Yeah.
But again, they're gonna point the finger at the landlord. And then I wind up talking to the landlord who says, well, you need to call the police. But then when you call the police say, no, you need to call the landlord and you need to have them come and have the person towed.
Yeah.
So now you're stuck in the middle trying to,
Right.
do this.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue. And
Yeah.
the only thing I can say is don't give up. And I
Yeah.
did. Eventually, I went to every business within that strip mall and I dropped off something stating, you are responsible for this. If you see somebody doing this, please let them know that they need to move
Yeah.
their motorcycle. And it was an employee of one of the businesses in the strip mall that was
Yeah.
doing it every day.
Yeah.
And that did eventually get it changed, but it took a lot.
Yeah. I live in Brownsburg, so I know whereabouts where you live. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
looks
noticed
like we've
earlier.
got a couple of hands raised. I know Samara has a question. Ryan, I saw you had your hand raised earlier, and then we have some questions in the chat too. So maybe we could let Samara ask her question, then Ryan, and then we can get to the questions in the chat. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. If you have somewhere that you need to be, feel free to leave. And if any questions don't get answered during this time, we can certainly reach out to Jeremy and get those answered offline.
Yes.
So Samara, then Ryan.
So my question is there a requirement for handicap parking when it comes to power chairs?
So that really goes more to the space in between the accessible parking
Yes.
spaces. And yes, there absolutely is an architectural guideline for that. I believe it falls under what is considered van accessible parking. Um, I don't know if it specifically is designated as parking for people who are utilizing powered chairs. So again, something I would be happy to look and see uh, what the code actually says. If you want me to take a look at that, I would be happy to include that when I send you guys an email.
And then Ryan, did you have a question that you still wanted to ask?
I didn't really have a question or anything. I just wanted to say thank you for this talk. And I mean, I've had a disability my whole life, but I'm new to using a wheelchair, and so I'm just now learning how to navigate all that kind of stuff. Even just getting into the bathroom at my local YMCA is difficult.
And yeah, so these are things that we need to talk with folks about. And again, there is there's this aspect of being ADA compliant without setting it up in a way that's successful. And so public restrooms, like I can't tell you how many times I go into a public restroom where the accessible stalls are at the end of the restroom and there's a sink right outside of the door of the stall, but there's no way to dry your hands. And so now you're using a wheelchair to move from one end of the bathroom to the other with wet hands, and you're going through way more paper towels to dry off your wheels than you ever would have needed to just dry off your hands. And and you feel like you need to wash your hands again when you get to where the towels are. So I mean, there are all sorts of issues like that. I want to say welcome to the life of using a wheelchair. It's not all terrible, but it really goes down to educating people about what your experience is. It's not intentional. It's just that they don't have the lived experience to look at that situation and say, we've not set this up right. So
Well, I want to share that I'm a parent of a kid, an 8-year old in a wheelchair, and uh even living in proximity to a wheelchair is nothing to being in a wheelchair, because I thought I understood accessibility because I've been her parent this whole time, but I did not. I was blind to a lot of things, but one of the good things that has come from being in a wheelchair is that she's learning how to use hers by watching me. So I just wanted to share that there has been a good since I'm new to it.
I I also want to throw out there for any wheelchair users, one of the things that is in my background. I earned my black belt in martial arts before I was 16 years old, so well before the car accident happened. I thought I would never do anything with it again. And then a couple years ago, I was asked to help somebody with Down syndrome who was doing a senior project on martial arts. And we did some stuff virtually where I demonstrated things with the arms and the upper body. Um, and that got me into looking at, could I actually do this? And so we are now, myself and my sensei are currently talking with RHI Sports and NeuroHope about doing a joint partnership to do an adaptive martial arts program once NeuroHope's new facility gets opened up at the old Five Seasons. So be on the lookout for that if that's something that any of you are at all interested in. So, and that's not just going to be for people in wheelchairs. That's going to be an adaptive martial arts program for anybody with a disability. So, keep that in mind.
It looks like Jan had a question in the chat just asking about restaurants that block public sidewalks for diners.
Yeah, that's an issue, isn't it? They need to make certain that there is a path to go through for people I mean, for anybody really, but That is, again, if you see that happen, ask the question. And that's whether or not something complies with the code is not the most important thing. Getting somebody like that restaurant owner or manager to look at the fact that they've created a situation where somebody perhaps with a mobility impairment is going to have to go off the sidewalk and perhaps into a more dangerous situation. You don't need to know whether or not the code allows that. You just need to be able to show that they are putting their operation and their guests and just any pedestrian who needs to utilize the public sidewalk into a dangerous situation. And once you can show that, and what that, I mean, the potential cost there of medical bills, possibly if somebody acquires a permanent disability as a result, or their current disability gets aggravated to a point where they need in-home health care as a result of some accident that happens because of some stupid oversight like that, could cost an operation tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. So just being able to say that, once you get them to recognize that it could affect their bottom line because they were ignorant of people with disabilities, the largest minority in the world, then they start to open their mind to maybe we should consider what this person is saying. Are there, I have the chat open, but I haven't looked at everything closely.
I did have another question. Those like scooters in downtown. We all met up downtown not too long ago. And I wasn't a wheelchair user then, and so it wasn't on my radar. But everyone was like really mad about those scooters being in the path of wheelchairs on the sidewalk, and I remember
I
that
hate
stuck with
those
me.
things. I hate
And
those
now
things.
a friend of mine, and so my question is, it like, are companies required to consult people about that? Because now the company is got this new campaign where they're getting scooters that are more accessible to people who can't walk. But so I'm supposed to leave my wheelchair on the side of the road, hop on your scooter, swipe my credit card, so that, like, I, instead of finding out that maybe they need a rack to put these out of the way that is required, like you know, like at Aldi, when you have to put your cart back to get your quarter back, right?
Right.
Like, because they're in the way, and instead of trying to include us in the conversation about them being in the way, they're trying to include us in the joyride of the scooter. Does
Interesting,
that make
isn't it?
sense? Yeah.
Yeah. Nothing about us without us. And so yeah, I mean, the fact that they're starting to explore more accessible scooters and whatnot, I would bet that they probably don't have somebody with a disability working with them. I believe that is going to fall under Title II for public entities, because I believe that's a city contracted program. I could be wrong. It could be under public accommodations, but I'm pretty sure that those programs, those, you know, rent and ride situations, that those are city contracts. Those are not necessarily, you know, an individual private company that's providing an entertainment experience. So they did coordinate with the city before they came in. The GCPD told them they would be an issue. And the city essentially said, okay, it's up to people not to put them in crosswalks. So again, this is an issue that I think you would want to take up with the city's ADA coordinator. And I will tell you, in Indianapolis, that individual right now is somebody who is super overstressed and is actually filling two different roles within the city government. City county government. And yeah, I think the more that we engage with those offices, the more it becomes evident to whoever's in charge of the administration that those offices are important. If the ADA coordinator for the city were able to show that they needed additional support staff because of the community engagement with that office, I think that would be a beautiful thing that would help all of us. but it's going to be very uncomfortable for the person in that seat until they can get that support. But yeah, we need to utilize that. And if you're not making contact with that individual, I mean, I had challenges with that office because of turnover. And again, finding an ally within whatever organization, I wasn't making any progress with the Office of Disability Affairs, but what I needed also lined up with the Office of Minority and Women's Business Development. So I went that route and I started communicating with that office and finally got an ally who could work behind the scenes on the communication issues that I was having. So don't take a non-answer or a closed door as the reason to stop. It's the reason to look at the obstacle and say, how do I get around this obstacle? And as people who've lived our lives with disabilities or with loved ones with disabilities, getting around obstacles is what we become experts at. We just have to
Jeremy,
recognize that.
thank you for that. We really appreciate it. And I do want to put a wrap on this because you've been so generous today, not only to give us the original hour, but to extend your time by an extra 30 minutes. We really appreciate that. We recognize that there are some additional questions, but what we'll do is compile those and maybe wrap all of that up in that email, that group email that we had going earlier. And we really value your partnership and look forward to continuing this conversation for a very, very long time because it's extremely valuable information.
It is my pleasure. Please, if there any follow-up stuff, I am happy to get back with you on. I have copied the chat. You guys have my email address. You are welcome to email me either as a group or individually. And I will get back to you with the questions that are in the chat that I didn't get to, and anything else that you come up with that you email me in the meantime. I do want to ask, did I cover information that you already knew, or did I give you information that that is something you're going to still need to take some time to consider and digest?
Yeah, one of the things that we're going to do is put together a post-presentation survey. And Jeremy, I would certainly like to consult with you to see if there's any specific information that would be helpful to you that you're looking for. But programmatically, this is something that I want to see, what the fellows thought and what their feedback is. I anticipate that it's going to be very, very good. We've seen some chats here that indicate they're very happy with what they've heard today. So we'll do that and then give them an opportunity in that group email to provide their additional feedback if they have any. But early indications are that you're a rock star.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
I did notice one last question in the chat about what do I do when someone parks on the line? And I do want to answer that real quick, which is that then forces me to either park in a way that takes up 2 spots, or to find another location where I can park. But what I always do when I see those issues, whether or not the person follows up, is I go to whoever's in charge of the facility and I draw their attention to the problem so that they can at the very least put a note on the person's car that lets them know that they've created a parking issue for somebody else and ask that they not do that in the future. Again, you have no idea whether or not that passive advocacy is going to work, but at least you're not being silent about it. So.
Okay. Thank you again, Mary Beth and Becky. I'll turn this over to you to do the administrative wrap. And as I mentioned, I'll follow up with each of you and we'll just kind of go from there. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you all. Be well. And I will get an email out to you hopefully by the end of the day on Monday at the latest. So.
All right. We appreciate you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.